Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. In this episode, we are going to actually install the crankshaft and finally proceed with assembling the engine. I hope so far in this series you've seen the importance of quality assurance. My build of this engine is going to have, in the end, 4 tiers of quality assurance. The first was the machine shop, which you should be able to trust. They're supposed to do their job right. Second is auditing your machine shop, which we did, and thank goodness we did, because we found that 2 of the connecting rod journals were a whole thousandth out of spec. That's supposed to be 1 to 1.5 thousandths, and the machine shop considered it good enough to have it be 2.5 thousandths, which is out of the maximum service spec. So I had to pay a different machine shop to resize the rods just to connect those or correct those 2 issues. So that shows you the importance of that. And that, I mean, that was not a good thing for me, but for you guys, that was good just to see a live situation where it shows the importance of you investing in a micrometer, dial bore gauge, and auditing your machine shop. Tier 3 is going to be Plastigauge. A lot of people talk down on Plastigauge, but it still is a tool. When we put the crankshaft in here and check the Plastigauge, if something is off, we'll be glad we did, because then the Plastigauge audited me, and then we can go back and correct an issue before it's catastrophic. And then finally, tier 4 is going to be, as we're building the engine, you spin things once it's lubricated. Of course, you spin the rotating assembly and go by feel to feel if there's anything wrong, if there's grabbing or a feel of out of roundness. You want everything to be smooth. So that's 4 tiers of quality assurance to do the engine right. So let's get started and get this engine going. Okay, so I have cleaned the crankshaft and I've cleaned the bearings again just for doing this test to make sure everything is represents the clearance it's going to be. I'm using green Plastigauge because this goes down to 1/1000th. On one side, you'll see your measurements are in millimeters. The other side is in inches. We're going to be our clearances are going to be needing to be around a little less than 1 thou up to 1.5 thou to be within spec. So you open this up and you don't rip it into pieces with your hand. You cut it with scissors. It's just basically it's like a string covered with wax, and you lay the Plastigauge long ways like this across each of the journals. Also, for this test at this time, the thrust washers are not in there, because that is the test that comes next. But for just doing this last test for clearances, it's that they don't need to be in there. So what can help is measure your Plastigauge width on the bearing while it's on the table, and that makes it easier to handle, and then you can cut it to the right size with your scissors. And then now we'll transfer this to the actual journal it's going to be on the crankshaft, and then do that to all 5. Okay, so we got the Plastigauge laid across on all 5. Now we're going to install the caps in order and torque them to spec. I'm also going to be using the actual brand new bolts from the dealer on this stage, so it replicates the real life scenario of what that gap will be. It should not be different from using the old bolts, but this is just a quality assurance step just in case that does change something. Okay, I just cleaned the bearing, but notice how it is dry. This is not lubed, and the crank is not lubed. When you're doing Plastigauge, you're not going to be spinning it, and you're not going to be testing thrust bearing clearance either, because it'll smear the Plastigauge. Okay, so all the bolts are installed. Now I only threaded them in by hand to where it touched. I didn't tighten whatsoever. We're going to do that on the next stage. In the book, this is the order we're going to be doing it. Make sure that those two little ring grooves, or these things right here, are towards you while you're doing it. That's the orientation in the book. And then torque to 16 foot-pounds in that order. Then we're going to do that thing where we make a mark and turn it 90 degrees, repeating that sequence. And then it's done, and then we can undo it all in reverse order and check what the Plastigauge says. Okay, now I made all my Sharpie marks at the 12 o'clock position on all the bolts. Now we're going to do the same exact sequence here, turning each one of those 90 degrees. Okay, they've all been turned 90 degrees. Now we just get to take the whole thing apart again, and it'll just be like when we did engine disassembly. Do no more than a quarter turn at a time. And we're gonna do it in reverse order. Let's see, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And then take the crankshaft out, and when we take it out, you lift straight up. Okay, got everything to where they're finger loose. We're back to square one, like this assembly. And see what we get. Hopefully it's not sticking to the inner bearing, but that's a good reading. And that went nice and flat on that too, so that's good. Okay, so I'm gonna line these up on the table here and remove all of them, then we'll check our readings. Okay, got the caps removed, and we got good results on all four of them. Now in the book, it says that ideally you want to be basically 4 10,000ths, which, I mean, if that was a 5, that'd be half a thousandth, or 9 10,000ths, which is just right under 1,000th, right? But max, like max oil clearance, I mean, that's like when you're getting close to needing to do a rebuild. 2.8 thousandths, or almost 3. So looking at this gauge, 3 is that little white one right there. Ideally, we want to be hovering around 1,000th. I already know from doing the micrometer, most of mine are hovering between 1 and 1.5. So let's see what we got. This first one is, we're looking at that we're hovering at 1.5, which is good. 3, I mean, that would be the 3 right there, which is too much, but whoops, sorry about the focus. So yeah, we're hovering about 1.5, so that's good. This one, maybe just barely under 1.5. We're kind of getting closer to the 1/1000th, which is good. But we're not even close to 2. Not even close to 2, not even close to 3, so that's good. Middle one, we are, looks like we're between 1 and 1.5, so that's good. Next one, about 1.5, and last one, let's see, oops, no, it's a little bigger than that, so looks like we're about 1.5 right there too. So yeah, so that's good. So we're averaging 1.5. That's within spec. Just I want to be, I mean, the larger the gap is, technically that's more oil and more cooling, but you lose oil pressure too. But that's your service limit. That's like towards when the engine's going to be worn out. So we're kind of balanced in the middle of good oil pressure, but good oil cooling as well. So I'm happy with those readings. Okay, now I've taken the crankshaft out. You just lift straight up. Now we got to clean all the plastigage off, both the journal and underneath the bearings. I'm using carb cleaner and a paper towel, and that's working great. I already did this one, so clean the crankshaft. All right, guys, we are now going to move on to the next part of assembly. And yes, I said we're moving on to assembly, and you're like, why are we still checking clearances? Because some clearances can't be checked until you're assembling the bottom part of the engine. But next we're going to check thrust clearance. Now thrust clearance is controlled by these little guys. These are called your thrust bearings or thrust washers. This engine only has them on the middle journal. So they sit in here like this, and the cap of the crankshaft covers that little tab right there, so it can't spin. And then the counterweight of the flange of the crankshaft hugs it in like this, so it can't go anywhere. And what that does is it controls how much the crankshaft can move back and forth. When you let off the clutch, that pressure pushes against the crankshaft this way and puts that load onto that thrust washer. So the way I've seen it done that I like is you lubricate the journals a little bit with just normal engine oil, and then install the bearing caps, but you torque them to that first stage, just the 16 foot-pounds in order. Then you seat the thrust washers, where you pry the crankshaft this way, so it pushes against this bearing and actually puts it flat against the block, so it's seated. Then you push the other way so it's seated. Then you finish torquing it, then you take your measurement. So let's get started. Okay, so I've lightly coated the bearings with some engine oil, clean engine oil with just a brush, just a nice thin film. Now we're gonna set the crankshaft inside. Okay, now that the crankshaft is in, you can see now it's lubricated, so we're not going to be scratching anything as we move it side to side. But you see how, let's see, you can see these little channels right there and right there where the thrust washers can fit into. So we're going to stick it off to the side like that, so I've got tons of clearance. And take the thrust washer, make sure these oil grooves, it's flat on one side, grooves on the other, the grooves touch the crankshaft. And you can set it down like this, and then I might need two hands, but you're supposed to be able to, I might want to close that gap up just a little so it doesn't fall out the other side. Try to get it right in the middle. Okay, sorry. And feed that down into the block like so. Okay, now I'm gonna pull the crankshaft towards it to close it up and give me more clearance to drop in that other one. Okay, so again, grooves touching the crankshaft. A little tight right there. Okay. It just falls right in. Okay, so then they're both sitting in there. Okay, now we're going to install the caps and then do the tightening sequence, just stage 1 to the 16 foot-pounds. Okay, and I'm also going to be taking my little brush with the clean engine oil, and I'm going to be putting just a very, very thin film of oil on each journal, because the way that I've seen it done that I liked is what you measure the thrust clearance with the crankshaft sitting this way, then you rotate it 180 degrees, which you will be glad you have the lube for that, then check it again, and then see if there's discrepancies. If there is a discrepancy, that can reveal that these thrust washers aren't seated, which means it's tilted one way or another, kind of like the threads on a screw, and that can make the crankshaft walk one way or the other, like it's riding on threads, and they call that crank walk. So that's a way to help check for that. So so next I'm putting oil on the main journals, and then putting the caps on, torquing them to 16 foot-pounds. Okay, also note that I am using the brand new screws again, but I have already gone through and cleaned the marker off from the Plastigauge step with some rubbing alcohol. So because we are going to be retorquing them again, we need to put a new Sharpie dot on there. So okay, so you got the crankshaft in, lightly lubricated, the crank bolts torqued to 16 foot-pounds. Then I stopped. I didn't do that 90 yet. Then I clamped a piece of scrap metal that I had to the side of the block so my dial indicator could stick to the aluminum block. Set it up. Then I wanted to make sure that those thrust washers were seated, so I took a screwdriver and pried on the crankshaft against the block, not any delicate surface in there. Made sure that this was scooted forward all the way to push that thrust bearing flat so it's seated. And then I did it the other way to make sure that one was flat and seated. Then push it back forward as far as it'll go. And you can just pry in here. You can pry right there. Scoot that crankshaft as far forward as it'll go. Then have your dial indicator touch the nose of the crankshaft and make that as parallel as you can with the crankshaft. Now, zeroing these things out are a pain because you barely touch it, it throws off everything. Well, oh, it's so hard. You barely even tap it. It throws off your reading. But some people don't even zero it out. They'll just count the lines. But it's... Oh, there we go. We'll go with that. Okay. So, crankshaft right now is as far forward as it can go. Now, when we pry it back the other way, the needle should move and give us a reading. So I'm going to stick my screwdriver in here. Oh, see, I already did it. And then if I do it back forward, it should go back to 0. Okay. Now we're going to count the lines and see how much we're getting. It's not perfectly on 0, but each one of those spaces is 5 10,000ths or just half a thousandth. So every 2 is 1,000th. So make sure it's far forward. Okay. 3.5 to 4. We'll just say that. Okay. The book says standard thrust clearance 3.5 to 7.5. So we're good. I think they screwed up here. It says maximum 1.2, but standard's 3.5. So I think that's a typo, but yeah, 3.5 to 7.5. So we're 4. So we're good. So that means next we're going to rotate it 180 degrees. This is why it's lubricated. And check our reading again. So we're like negative. Okay, so the little needle fell off the edge of the crankshaft nose. That's why it wasn't moving, but got that pretty dang close to 0. Now, how much does it jump? So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. It's the exact same, so good. Okay, now we're gonna finish torquing that the rest of the way with doing the 90-degree turn and repeat this procedure to see if it changes anything. Okay, made my marker lines, did the procedure torquing it with that extra 90-degree turn. Now we're going to check again what the thrust clearance is. And we got 1, 2, 3, 4, like 4.5, a little over 4.5, or back actually. 1, 2, 3, 4, like 4.5. So that's good. Now rotate the crank 180. One, 2, 3, 4, 4.5. So we're good, folks. We're within spec for thrust clearance. Now we get to take it apart one last time, clean it, and we can put on real assembly lube and put that crankshaft in for the last time. Okay, so I have taken out the crankshaft. I've cleaned it. I've cleaned the bearings and the bearings of the caps. This is the assembly lube I am using, is Permatex Ultra Slick, and I'm wearing a glove, and I've coated each bearing with that. The thrust washers are luckily staying in place and cooperating, but I put a little on those surfaces as well, and then I did a little extra credit and just drizzled a little into the little groove so it holds it like a pool. I'm now going to lube the journals with my finger, set it in place, lube the underside of those, and then set those in place. Also, these inner flat surfaces right here next to the journal, I'm getting that as well on each one. And this is where the surface for the thrust washers, I'm getting that. Getting these inner surfaces right there, all the way around. It's kind of hard to show you, but I put one last big goop of the stuff on there, and this is ready to go. Then I'm putting this on top. So it's just got that little extra that hopefully just stays trapped in there. Okay, so I just finished torquing everything that last 90-degree turn, 1 through 10. Now is that 4th tier quality assurance thing, and this is by feel. You rotate the crankshaft, and what you're just feeling for is consistency in the rotation. It feels like this assembly lube feels like thick peanut butter, so there is resistance, but is it consistent? You don't want to feel it give then go, or give then get tight, then give then get tight. You know, that can be an issue. But it's just nice, uniform, smooth rotation. And that feels awesome to me. I don't feel any binding. I don't feel any variation in the rotation, like it's an oval shape. If you're on this step and you're unsure, take the block into a machine shop and just have them spin it and feel themselves. Just say, hey, will you just feel this and tell me if that feels okay? I'm noticing this little spot where it seems like it's grabbing a little bit, and I'm not sure, but that feels perfect to me. I'm very happy with that. So that is officially installed. Next, we are going to move on to installing the pistons.
So thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and hope this helped you out.